CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Robin Dwyer.
And I'm Paul Barber. Our top stories: Blackrock raises $1 billion for its Maiden Chinese market fund.
An explosive start for Bitcoin in El Salvador. Cryptocurrency becomes legal tender, sparking protests in the capital.
The international community reacts cautiously to the Taliban's interim government.
Paris attacks suspect Salah Abdeslam tells a French court he was a soldier of Islamic State as a large terror trial gets underway. Blackrock has raised more than $1 billion for the first ever mutual fund in China that's owned solely by a foreign firm. More than 110,000 Chinese investors subscribed to the fund, which was made possible after China scrapped a foreign ownership cap on the sector last year.
The successful launch is being watched closely by several other global players now preparing to enter the lucrative market. Let's get more now from John Terrett, live from New York. So this sounds exciting. What's it all about, John?
Well, isn't it lovely for me to be the lead story in our program and to be able to do a nice story about China? It's fantastic. Let me tell you about Blackrock, first of all. You know, Blackrock is one of the investment firms on Wall Street. I always talk to you about JP Chase because really that's the only bank that anybody observing what's happening on Wall Street ever seems to care about. I'm only not even joking when I say that. That's true. But Blackrock is similar to JP Chase and Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, but it kind of flies under the radar a lot more. You don't really hear very much about it. But it is the company to work for on Wall Street. If you can get a job at Blackrock, you're okay. It really is that good. Now, it's known as one of the world's largest asset managers, and I think these things change minute by minute, but I think it probably is today the world's largest asset manager. And by that I mean they have under their care right now, in the second quarter of this year anyway, $9.49 trillion that they're looking after of other people's money. And that's up from $7.32 trillion in 2020. And think about that, guys. That is literally 3 infrastructure bills that Joe Biden is trying to propose to keep the U.S. economy going. It's 3 times that they have under their care. Now, months ago on the program, I did tell you, I remember reporting that BlackRock was going into China and that it would be the first financial firm there to set out its stall in China that was entirely owned by the overseas company, in this case, BlackRock. Now, normally, as you know, when U.S. companies go into China, they have to give up some kind of ownership or they give up some part of their strategy so that China can learn from that. But not in this case. And it does indeed come after China changed foreign ownership rules regarding this kind of company. So there they are, BlackRock in China, entirely independent of the Chinese authorities. And now they have said in the past 24 hours that they have opened their... It's a series of mutual funds, basically. They've opened them now, and the response has been absolutely mind-blowing. It's been huge, apparently.
Yes, tell us a bit more about how the response has been.
Well, basically, I think what they did last month, in August, maybe July time, they started advertising in China, saying BlackRock is coming and you might like to think about putting your money our way. According to BlackRock, and I have no way of independently confirming this, but it's been widely reported here, including in the Journal. According to BlackRock, 111,000 Chinese people have come forward to invest their money. Extraordinary number. According to BlackRock, that equates to 6.68 billion yuan. Well, I can't do the conversion, but it is apparently just over $1 billion US has been put into the fund or promised to the fund or earmarked for the funds in some way. Now, BlackRock is very fond of China. It is reported that a couple of months ago they got their investors to pile into China, or one of the news sheets they put out suggested they pile into China. However, of course, there are others that see things differently. Let's enter to the story now. George Soros, who is the billionaire philanthropist and investor, he thinks this is a blunder. Writing in the Wall Street Journal, he said so within the past 24 hours. He called it a blunder and a tragic mistake. And he was citing the crackdowns that have been going on in Beijing, particularly regarding tech companies and education companies. And he thinks that that may continue into other sectors of the economy as well. Blackrock, as I say, flies below the radar most of the time. They don't make a fuss. You don't hear from them very often. You don't really know who's running the company unless you really research it. But they did tell CNBC, which is the business channel here, that the relationship between the United States and China is a large and complex economic relationship. So the adults are in the room, because that's the kind of answer you want. We know these two big economies have to work together. We know there's a symbiosis between both of them. And yes, there are bumps on the road, but they will be overcome as time goes by. Now, finally, other big Wall Street investment banks do recommend that their customers look at China as well, possibly invest in China as well, but they always add the word cautiously. Now, here at the New York Stock Exchange today, the market is down, but the Nasdaq is down the most, about 1%. And the reason for that today is the chip sector is dragging it down, and also the Chinese ADRs, the stocks that Chinese companies that trade here at the Nasdaq are down sharply today. Guys?
John Terrett at the New York Stock Exchange. Thank you very much.
Bitcoin has suffered its heaviest losses in almost 3 months following El Salvador's historic adoption of the cryptocurrency as legal tender. There's been widespread anger among Salvadorans at their government's decision to accept Bitcoin alongside the US dollar. Many believe the coin is too volatile, and at one point on Tuesday it fell 18%, wiping $180 billion from the market. It's since recovered slightly, but is still trading lower than it was when launched in El Salvador.
But El Salvador's government continues to defend the move, saying citizens living abroad will save millions of dollars in commission on money they send home. Ahead of the launch, El Salvador bought its first 400 bitcoins, adding to the volatility and temporarily pushing up the price.
To promote its use, the government has launched a digital wallet called Chivo and will pay a $30 Bitcoin bonus to those who download it.
Salvadorans will also be able to withdraw funds in cash from 200 ATMs and 50 consulting centres across the country.
Alistair Baberstock has more from Mexico City.
More than 20 years after adopting the US dollar as its currency, El Salvador is embracing another legal tender, Bitcoin. With a dedicated app for use nationwide, President Nayib Bukele is leading his country into a new cryptocurrency economy.
This is like no currency we've seen before. There are no bills, no metal coins. Salvadorans will have an app where they can receive Bitcoin.
El Salvador is now the first country in the world to accept Bitcoin as legal tender, starting an economic and social experiment with the volatile and confusing currency. Indeed, a recent study by a leading regional university found that less than 5% of Salvadorans say they actually understand what Bitcoin is. While the dollar will remain an official currency, the addition of Bitcoin has stirred unease and sparked protests. Still, not everyone is against it.
I'm prepared to accept it because I think the president will not harm us. On the contrary, technology is there to update us. I've got the example of people selling desserts in the El Sonte beach. They haven't rejected it.
The reference to El Sonte is key. Also known as Bitcoin Beach, it's one of El Salvador's most popular tourist resorts and has been operating in Bitcoin for going on 2 years already. And Mark Falson is a travel YouTuber who visited earlier this year and saw real development potential for the wider country.
Something like 70% of citizens in El Salvador don't have access to banks. So one of the things that people have done with Bitcoin is they've gotten access to having digital money. And that means that people are able to save. They are saving money for the first time in their life. So that seems to be one of the really big advantages of bringing Bitcoin to El Salvador, is that people can have money that's not put under their mattress. And that really is literal.
As El Salvador sets out on its cryptocurrency experiment, critics and supporters alike will be watching closely the results. Alistair Baverstock, CGTN, Mexico City.
Earlier, our colleague Nuija Barkil spoke to Jeffrey Tucker, president of the Brownstone Institute for Social and Economic Research. He asked whether the shift towards a cryptocurrency was largely inevitable.
5 years ago, if you had predicted that El Salvador would adopt a Bitcoin as legal tender, people would have thought you were totally crazy. So that's why a lot of inevitable things are, is that once they happen, they seem that way. But it did take, a president with some vision and with some good advisors, and the possibility of a genuine monetary crisis developing to make this happen. And if it works in El Salvador, then we're going to start to see other countries adopt the same sort of thing. So this is a big deal. This is why the crypto community is so very excited, and the price trends overnight, I think, reflect that also.
Despite the excitement, though, some protesters, some critics say there's a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding as well as some of their biggest fears when it comes to making Bitcoin legal tender. What do you see as the main problems ahead for Salvadorians?
Central Americans are far more sophisticated in dealing with monetary and financial matters than Americans are. Americans can't even conceive of it, but this is a normal course of events in a place like El Salvador to be toggling between many different currencies. So Bitcoin's just introduced into that mix. I mean, the big problem we saw develop overnight in El Salvador was that the official wallet crashed because so many people were trying to download it, and it had scaling problems, which is going to be always a problem in the crypto world, scaling. So this happened already in 2013 and 2015 and so on. So that's the biggest problem that developed overnight. But what seems to be a problem is a kind of a good problem to have. In other words, everybody wants to use Bitcoin right now. And in terms of the other issues that everybody's raising, about volatility, that's hardly a surprise. Everybody knows that it's going to be more volatile than the dollar, and that has upsides and downsides to it. But life is risky, and you don't have to use Bitcoin for trading in El Salvador if you don't want to. But the price trajectory has generally looked very good over 10 years. So I think it represents a real opportunity for many citizens to try an alternative money out and see how it goes.
Do you think this will set a precedent for other countries?
If it goes well, and I think I'm prepared to say that it is going to go well. I think it shows a lot of promise, and it could be a very interesting thing to watch as we go forward. Other countries adopting this, especially depending on developments in international money markets. We are seeing the problem of inflation affecting the U.S. dollar and many currencies around the world. Do you want to continue to hold a constantly depreciating national currency, or do you want to move something like Bitcoin, which is arguably a deflationary currency in the sense that it grows more valuable in terms of goods and services than the national currency? The national currency is going down in value, Bitcoin's going up in value. It will seriously incentivize people to start moving more and more into this crypto ecosystem. At least that's the way crypto enthusiasts see it, and I think the scenario seems more likely than ever.
The US markets regulator has told Coinbase Global that it plans to sue the cryptocurrency exchange if it goes ahead with plans to launch a program allowing users to earn interest by lending digital assets. The move comes as the Securities and Exchange Commission tightens its scrutiny on cryptocurrencies. Coinbase says it now plans to delay introducing its Lend product until at least October.
A US court has ruled that directors of plane maker Boeing must face legal action from shareholders after the fatal crashes involving its 737 MAX plane. A judge in Delaware claims that investors had lost billions of dollars as Boeing's stock fell, with the board failing in its duty to protect the firm's value. The crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia 3 years ago left 346 people dead. Flaws in the aircraft's flight control system were found to be the cause.
The fraud trial of Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes is set to begin in a US federal court. The former Silicon Valley star is accused of lying about her now defunct blood testing startup, once valued at $9 billion. Prosecutors say she knowingly defrauded investors and patients, claiming the company's devices could run tests more quickly and accurately than a laboratory. Holmes has pleaded not guilty.
British lawmakers are debating a controversial plan unveiled by Prime Minister Boris Johnson to increase taxes to help fund health services. The money will be used to help the National Health Service clear a backlog of cases built up over the pandemic and pay for social care costs of the elderly. Critics say the plan means poorer workers will be subsidising older generations who want to pass on wealth to their children.
The battle for ownership of Britain's fourth largest supermarket chain could be heading to a rare auction. Two separate US private equity firms are hoping to buy Morrisons. Last month, this agreed to an almost $10 billion offer by Clayton, de Villiers and Rice, but the sale hasn't yet been finalised. Rival group Fortress Investments could still trump that bid, and Morrisons has told UK regulators an auction may be needed.
Still ahead here on CGTN, the US Secretary of State meets some of those who fled the Taliban as he continues diplomatic efforts over the country's future.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back. Remember, CGTN is available to watch for free on all major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online, on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, also YouTube and Dailymotion, as well as CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, we're available 24 hours a day on Freeview.
The US Secretary of State has arrived in Germany for further talks with allies on the future of Afghanistan. While meeting Afghan refugees in the Gulf state, Antony Blinken said the international community is watching closely to see how the Taliban behave in power.
He added that safe passage must be guaranteed for all those eligible Afghans still in Kabul who are seeking to leave the country. Let's go live now to Frankfurt and Ryan Thompson. Ryan, Antony Blinken has now met German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas. How well do we know what's been said?
Hi there, Paul. Yeah, it's been a busy day for the Secretary of State. He's been at Ramstein Air Base, which is not too far from us here in Frankfurt. After visiting the base, meeting with the German foreign minister, and seeing some of the U.S. efforts to take military operations from the ground in Afghanistan and finally rebase them in Germany, including a massive resettlement of a large amount of refugees, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is finally speaking now, giving an update about where things stand. One of the biggest things that came out of his meeting with the German foreign minister is that they will expand their efforts to eventually have a group of what they hope to be 20 nations to meet with the Taliban and to begin some sort of discussion, because they see it now as it's much more important to have a dialogue going compared to the past when they opted to keep them completely in the dust and leave them isolated. As he speaks now, we're also seeing that there's issues about charter flights and getting those final remaining Americans and foreigners out of Afghanistan. The Taliban are not allowing those flights to depart, despite the fact that the U.S. is doing everything it can to get those flights into the air. They really have said that any legitimacy or support by the U.S. government for the Taliban government needs to be earned. So he's drawing a hard line that the U.S. will judge their actions before actually committing to a certain level of recognition here.
And Ryan, the way the Kabul pullout was handled by Allied forces has strained relations between the United States and Europe. How will Secretary Blinken be addressing this?
Yeah, well, it's really clear that Anthony Blinken is well aware of where things stand. And the U.S. is at a point right now where it's trying to figure out what it will do next on Afghanistan, what its policy is. But before it can do that, it needs to check in with its partners and its allies to figure out what they are actually ready to commit. Of course, in the weeks that followed that chaotic pullout, tensions were incredibly strained, especially with European partners. It does seem that they have eased now, and the comments made by Heiko Maas ahead of this meeting today did suggest that he was very eager to meet with the U.S. Secretary of State and took a much more positive tone. He said that the dialogue with the U.S. has improved dramatically, its most important partner, and that they are looking forward to really moving this file ahead in terms of what they can do on Afghanistan.
European governments, of course, now dealing with Afghan refugees, many arriving through unofficial channels. Will the talks touch on this?
Nothing that we've heard just yet, because the interesting thing is for the United States and for Germany, they have two big issues. In the case of the United States, there's an ocean, of course, that divides much of this potential humanitarian crisis from arriving at their doorstep and arriving at their borders. In the case of Heiko Maas, the German foreign minister, or any European leaders, they know that is not exactly the case. And we've heard the rhetoric changing in recent days and recent weeks about how they need to approach the potential humanitarian crisis and then a potential refugee crisis that could come from that. We've heard a lot of leaders saying that they do not want a repeat of 2015 when Europe let in over 1 million refugees from Syria to settle within its borders. We've heard the Czech Prime Minister in recent days saying that Europe needs to find a way to keep these people in Afghanistan with a healthy life. Just weeks earlier, we heard the man who wants to replace Angela Merkel, Armin Laschet, saying that he does not want to see a repeat of 2015 on his doorfront. Heiko Maas has said that he has serious concerns about a humanitarian crisis brewing and the fact that that would eventually lead to many, many struggles that would arrive at Europe's doorstep. It's likely that that was largely included in much of his discussions today with Anthony Blinken about how they can continue to bring aid into Afghanistan, but also make sure it works within the confines of the relationship that they are trying to establish with the Taliban.
Ryan Thompson in Frankfurt, many thanks. Well, anti-Taliban forces have called on the international community to reject the Taliban's interim government, saying it is illegal. The all-male cabinet is made up entirely of Taliban leaders or their associates, despite the group earlier pledging diversity.
Since Tuesday's announcement of key interim positions, there's been relative calm on the streets of the capital, Kabul. Nui Jabakal reports.
There are fewer horns and less traffic, but the streets of Kabul look busy once again. More than 3 weeks after the Taliban took control of the Afghan capital, it's named a new interim government. For the taxi drivers who've worked these roads for years, things appear calmer, but business is down.
I'm very happy because there is full security in the city. However, the monthly wage jobs and opportunities are very limited.
The economy in the previous government was a little bit better, but since the new Islamic Emirate came, the security conditions are very good, because the security personnel check each car one by one in search of thieves or suicide bombers.
Since the Islamic Emirate came, some of us have lost jobs and businesses. We don't have any specific demands from our government. The only things we want are peace and good income jobs.
The Taliban say this is a temporary government, but the lack of inclusivity is clear. All 33 members of the cabinet are men, mostly religious figures, and there's little ethnic diversity.
Actually, we have been facing this uncertain situation since the arrival of the Taliban to Afghanistan, including in Kabul. The Taliban should show in practice now their promises towards women.
Small numbers are still choosing to protest in some cities like Herat. They're calling for more rights for women and minorities and channeling anger at Pakistan's alleged role in the country. There's also pressure on Western states like the US and UK to avoid recognising the Taliban government and, in essence, the new reality on the ground.
Our new government will have positive relations with China, Russia and other countries. Our relations will be good with all regional nations and the international community, and we have no problem with any countries in the world, nor in the region.
The Taliban says Afghanistan won't be used for terror attacks in the future. That'll be a priority for the international community and how it responds to the group's self-declared takeover. Closer to home, there are other concerns. Many Afghans are still worried about what the future will hold. Life is slowly returning to normal here, but fear and uncertainty are still looming large.
And Naweed joins us now in the studio. So, Naweed, we've heard what the US thinks about the interim cabinet. What kind of reaction has there been from Europe?
Well, it's been pretty similar reaction. A lot of condemnation of this new interim government put out by the Taliban. Let's start with here in the UK. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, his spokesman, said we'll continue to judge the Taliban on their actions, something Downing Street's been saying a lot recently. We would want to see in any situation a diverse group in leadership that seeks to address the pledges that the Taliban themselves have set out. The EU, the European Union over in Brussels, similar condemnation there, particular concern about the lack of diversity and representation. Peter Stano, the spokesperson for the EU's Foreign Policy Service, had this to say, quote, "It does not look like the inclusive and representative formation in terms of the rich ethnic and religious diversity of Afghanistan we hope to see." So the Western powers not too happy with the new shape of this government. 33 cabinet members, they're all men, all from the main ethnic tribe in Afghanistan, the Pashtuns, and they're all largely religious figures as well. The key question will be, what will they do in response? Aid is one area that's absolutely crucial for Afghanistan, and in that regard there is some positive news for ordinary Afghans. The European Commission Vice President Maroš Šefčovič said that they will continue to provide aid for Afghanistan, but that longer term that money could be dependent on the Taliban upholding basic freedoms. We've seen from the protest that there may be some tensions to come there, and reports out of Afghanistan in the last few minutes suggesting that the Taliban are now going to ban protests unless they're approved by the Ministry of Justice and unless there's 24-hour notice given and approval given as well. But just in terms of the humanitarian situation on the ground, things do look pretty dire. The International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Mora, the chief of the ICRC, has just been there for 4 days meeting the Taliban, including one of the key members, Mullah Baradar, the head of the Taliban's political office, and he said that the humanitarian situation is desperate. Much more help is needed for Afghanistan at the moment, particularly with the economic crisis, which is causing food shortages, the drought, which is similarly causing problems with regards to food, and then also the inflation that this 3 or 4 weeks has caused has meant that a country which is already quite poor, people are struggling to pay for food, even those who are relatively well off in urban areas.
And there's been an apology from the former president over his handling of the takeover, hasn't there? Yeah, there has, and this is another story that really has caused a lot of division, a lot of criticism on social media. This is the statement we've got here. It's from Ashraf Ghani, the former president of Afghanistan. He, you'll remember a few weeks ago, fled when the Taliban were advancing on Afghanistan. It's quite a lengthy statement. I'll just read out some of the key points. Quote, "I left at the urging of the palace security, who advised me to remain risk setting off the same horrific street-to-street fighting that the city saw during the civil war, an attempt there, perhaps, critics say, to absolve himself from some of the blame, claiming that he didn't want to leave the country. More importantly," he goes on to say, "I must now address baseless allegations that as I left Kabul, I took with me millions of dollars belonging to the Afghan people.
These charges are completely and categorically false. He went on to say that I inherited a monster, referring to corruption that could not easily or quickly be defeated. Again, lots of his critics saying that under his watch, he served 2 terms as president, and in some form corruption actually got worse in some instances. As he left power, Afghanistan was ranked 165th out of 180 on Transparency International's corruption index. So lots of people say that under his watch, corruption was definitely alive, and it possibly even may have got worse. He then goes on to finish by saying, I offer my profound appreciation and respect for the sacrifice of all Afghans, especially the armed forces that he commanded until a few weeks ago, armed forces that eventually appear to have been unsuccessful in their 20-year fight against the Taliban, but an attempt to apologize to them. And then he finishes off saying, quote, I apologize to the Afghan people that I could not make it end differently. Some of his supporters seem to be happy that he's come out and spoken. He, remember, is based in the United Arab Emirates at the moment. The UAE has given him humanitarian asylum. But if you look at the general mood of the response to this, a lot of people still very critical of his role and the fact that he fled the country. As he says here, he didn't take the bags of money, as the ambassador in Tajikistan, the Afghan ambassador in Tajikistan, told the BBC. Some reports that it was up to $150 million, somewhere in that region. He says that's categorically false.
Louise Barkle, thanks very much. Well, let's go live now to Kabul and speak to Zamarullah Abasin. So, Zamarullah, is there any indication of how the new Taliban government will tackle shortages in the country?
Hello, Rob, and this is a challenge for the Taliban. That's why, according to Taliban, they formed the interim government and their cabinet to maintain the essential services in the country. Yet it's uncertain that the electricity that Afghanistan got, particularly the main 7 cities, and also the import and export issues are related to the same situation. Afghanistan was suffering a vacuum of power politically, and also there were communication lag between the businessmen of Afghanistan and the authorities in the region that usually have businesses between each other in the trades. That's why Taliban announced this. Yet at this moment, Kabul and other part of the country have the same electricity before the collapse of the Kabul, and also essential services yet available. There is no much more hunger that we can call it dramatic, but the looming economic catastrophe is on the way if the Taliban doesn't draw very accurate policies and plans in regard to control the situation in the future. That's what the people of the country are afraid. And Taliban also now being challenged about the international recognition, and they say we formed the current government because we want to control the internal issues and the essential services in the country. While all of their leaders are now controlling the key sectorial ministries, and many critics believe that they won't be able to easily control. But the Taliban say the ministerial level is political positions, and the rest, they will go through merit, and the situation will be controlled. Robin.
Zamarullah Abasin in Kabul, thanks very much.
China says it will maintain communication with the interim government in Afghanistan. Speaking to CGTN, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin says that its establishment has ended weeks of anarchy and is an essential step for reconstruction.
We respect the sovereign independence and territorial integrity of Afghanistan. China will never interfere in the country's internal affairs and will support the Afghan people to independently select a development path suited to their own national conditions. We hope Afghanistan can build an open and inclusive political structure, pursue moderate and steady domestic and foreign policies, resolutely strike various terrorist forces, and maintain friendly relations with other nations, especially its neighbours.
China says it will provide $30 million in aid to Afghanistan. The pledge, which includes grain, vaccines and other medicine, was made by the Chinese foreign minister in a virtual meeting with 5 of Afghanistan's neighbours. He says they should keep their borders open while strengthening intelligence sharing to prevent terrorists from infiltrating the country.
We welcome the Taliban's positive attitude towards political construction, anti-terrorism and relations with neighboring countries after entering Kabul. But the key is to put them into practice. There are two key points. First is to be inclusive, and second is to resolutely fight terrorism. We hope the Taliban can learn from the past, actively interact with all ethnic groups and factions under the interim government, keep its promises to the outside world, and become more recognized globally.
And the future of Afghanistan is the subject of this week's agenda with Stephen Cole here on CGTN. He's been speaking to the former head of coalition forces in Afghanistan, General David Petraeus, who made it very clear what he thinks the new Taliban government's priorities need to be.
Taliban is about to confront a very serious reality, and that is that their government budget requires somewhere in the neighborhood of $18 to $20 billion a year, and without U.S. and Japanese and other major donors funding, they're going to have a very substantial budget shortfall. And yes, they do control the poppy. They do have, a major export crop, albeit illegal, that they have controlled and has been a source of revenue. But the modest taxes and customs duties that they're going to be able to collect are going to leave in a yawning gap between what they can generate and what the government has had in the past. And that means that they won't be able to pay all these security forces, government workers, and the basic level of services, which has already been affected negatively because of the departure of many of the international aid organizations. They're going to have to determine how it is that they, again, address that shortfall. They're in for some very tough realities because of that basic situation, which is inescapable.
And you can see more of that interview with General David Petraeus on the agenda with Stephen Cole this weekend on CGTN.
You're watching Global Business Europe. Coming up, why the fight against HIV and TB in poorer countries has been made much harder because of COVID.
The EU's digital COVID certificate, which offers the promise of unlocking hassle-free travel around Europe this summer.
In less than 2 weeks' time, the Czech border will also open to all EU and Serbian citizens. 4.4 million Hungarians received their first dose of COVID vaccine.
18 and over can receive a COVID-19 vaccination, but it does come with conditions.
Third wave will probably take longer to emerge. This vaccination centre is part of a massive effort to try and drive down the numbers of the new variant that was first identified in India.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas. Nothing can stop an idea whose time has come, and this idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Robin Dwyer and Paul Barber. The headlines again. Blackrock raises $1 billion for its Maiden Chinese market fund.
An explosive start for Bitcoin in El Salvador. The cryptocurrency becomes legal tender, sparking protests in the capital.
And the international community reacts cautiously to the Taliban's interim government.
6 years after a terror attack that shook France, a trial is underway for 20 suspects, including the only surviving alleged attacker. In November 2015, a group allied to the Islamic State group launched coordinated attacks on several Paris locations. 130 people died.
Today, the main suspect, Salah Abdeslam, who was dressed all in black, told the court that he was a soldier of the Islamic State group, comments which unnerved some survivors. Ross Cullen visited the specially built Paris courtroom before the trial started.
It's a massive undertaking. 110 days of hearings are expected. 5 judges will be presiding over the legal proceedings with support from an additional 4 magistrates. You can get a sense of the size of the trial by the fact that they have had to construct a special temporary courtroom to hold the legal proceedings in here in the heart of the historic Court of Appeal in Paris. More than 300 lawyers are going to be representing the victims, the families of the victims, and also the defendants themselves. On the night of the 13th of November 2015, 3 groups of attackers set off suicide bombs outside the Stade de France, opened fire in bars, in restaurants and inside the Bataclan music venue, killing 130 people in what the then French President François Hollande described as an act of war. The so-called Islamic State claimed responsibility for the attacks. The trial is expected to last until March next year. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
Russia's emergencies minister, Yevgeny Zinichev, has died during a training exercise in the Arctic. According to media reports, the 55-year-old dived into the water to help save a cameraman who slipped and fell in. He also died. Mr. Zinichev has headed the high-profile emergencies ministry since 2018 and was in the Arctic overseeing large-scale drills.
In the wake of Sunday's coup, military leaders in Guinea have made good on a promise to free scores of political prisoners held by the ousted President Alpha Condé. At least 80 prisoners have been released, many of whom had campaigned against the former president's plans to hold on to power for a 3rd term. West African leaders are set to hold a summit on Thursday to discuss their response to the developing situation.
Israeli troops searching for 6 Palestinians who broke out of jail have reportedly detained several of their relatives. That's according to a Palestinian rights group, which added some of the family members were only held briefly. 6 high-profile inmates escaped from a high-security prison in the early hours of Monday. It's thought they dug a hole in the floor of their cell.
A massive fire has raged through an overcrowded prison near the Indonesian capital, Jakarta, killing at least 41 inmates. Most of those killed were convicted of drugs offences, including 2 foreigners. 80 others were injured.
The tragedy has revived a debate over prison safety and the country's strict narcotics laws. Silkina Aluwalia has more from Jakarta.
We know that the fire broke out at a prison block housing drug inmates, so that brings up an important conversation surrounding the criminal justice system when it comes to the imprisonment of drug offenders. The Institute for Criminal Justice Reform released a statement saying that the government must have better narcotics policies. And instead of putting drug offenders in prisons and seeing them as criminals, they're saying the government should focus on treating them in rehab centers. This will significantly bring down the number of inmates in prisons across the country, because currently there are around 28,000 people in prisons under Indonesia's strict narcotics laws, and that number will continue to increase. Authorities also do not take into account the problem of overcrowding in these prisons. And in relation to this specific incident, the block was only designed to house a little over 1,200 inmates, but it was packed with nearly 2,000 people. So as the fire broke out, it was very difficult to evacuate each and every person that were still locked in their cells. So safety is another issue that is being discussed right now, because most prisons in Indonesia are very poorly funded. So experts are now saying that an entire paradigm shift needs to happen, where police and prosecutors must pay attention to prison conditions and also start using non-imprisonment alternatives. Silkina Aluwalia, CGTN, Jakarta.
Moroccans are voting in parliamentary and regional elections. The ruling moderate Islamist Justice and Development Party, or PJD, is hoping to win a third term. It's headed coalitions for the past decade. About 18 million people are expected to cast their votes amid an economic crisis which has deepened since the coronavirus pandemic.
China and Britain say they will step up cooperation on climate change. The pledge was made during a video call between China's Vice Premier Han Zheng and UK's senior climate official Alok Sharma, who's in China to rally support for the Glasgow COP26 summit in November. Han says all parties attending the summit should turn emissions goals into specific action.
Mexico's Supreme Court has ruled that criminal penalties for terminating pregnancies are unconstitutional. The ruling in the northern state of Coahuila prevents women being prosecuted for getting a termination and could pave the way for the decriminalisation of abortions across the country. The procedure is currently severely restricted in all but 4 of the country's states.
A powerful earthquake struck southwestern Mexico's Acapulco, killing at least 1 man and damaging buildings. The 7.0 magnitude quake hit roughly 7 kilometres northeast of the beach resort on Tuesday night. It shook the hillsides around the city, downing trees and throwing large boulders onto roads, causing power outages in several states.
And pop star Britney Spears could soon be free from her father's financial control after he filed to end the controversial legal arrangement. Jamie Spears has been in control of much of Britney's life and finances since 2008, when she suffered a public mental health breakdown. In June, Britney described the arrangement as abusive and humiliating, and Jamie Spears has been under increasing public pressure to step aside.
Hong Kong has relaxed its quarantine rules for residents returning home, allowing people from the Chinese mainland to visit without having to face its quarantine procedures. CGTN reporter An Cheng has more.
Starting today, the Return to Hong Kong scheme is relaunching. So that means that Hong Kong residents traveling from Macau and the Chinese mainland can return to Hong Kong without having to undergo mandatory quarantine. Now, proof of a COVID-19 test is still necessary, and it must be taken within 72 hours before arrival. And there is a daily quota set for 6,000 residents, and that's split up among the 3 entry points into the city. So Shenzhen Bay has 3,000 spots. The Hong Kong-Zhuhai Macau Bridge, Hong Kong Port has 2,000, while Hong Kong's airport has 1,000 spots. And these people must apply for a quota through an online booking system. But there are exemptions for this scheme as well. Several places considered risky for the virus will be excluded, such as Yangzhou in Jiangsu province or Shangqiu City in Henan province. Now, this scheme originally launched last November, whereby Hong Kong residents from Macau and Guangdong province could return to the city without having to quarantine, and this was expanded to the rest of the Chinese mainland in April. But this scheme was largely suspended last month as a measure to prevent an outbreak from entering into Hong Kong's borders. So that meant that only residents from Guangdong province could enter. And authorities say the scheme is resuming now because the pandemic situation has stabilized in Hong Kong, Macau, and the Chinese mainland. Meanwhile, starting next week, non-Hong Kong residents can also enter the city without having to quarantine. That's if they're traveling from Macau or Guangdong province. And this is under the Come to Hong Kong scheme. So for that, the daily quota is set for 2,000 people. An Cheng, CGTN, Hong Kong.
Excess deaths from tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS will exceed those from COVID-19 in poor countries because of the disruption caused by the pandemic. That's according to the Global Fund, an alliance of governments, NGOs and private sector groups. Its executive director, Peter Sands, told us why.
Well, COVID has caused devastating damage, real reverses on the fight against HIV, TB and malaria, the 3 other biggest infectious disease killers in the world. And that's what the report we've just published shows.
And how many people are we talking about? How many people are affected, potentially deaths and with disease numbers?
Well, if I take TB, for example, which of the 3 diseases is probably the most affected, 1 million fewer people were treated for TB in 2020 than they were in 2019. And that inevitably, sadly, will translate into hundreds of thousands of more deaths. And if I take HIV, 22% or 37 million people less were tested for HIV. Now, not all of them will have had it, but the cases of HIV we don't test, don't get put on treatment, and if you're not put on treatment for HIV, you will die. So this has a huge impact, and the report only covers 2020. And what we know is that the knock-on impact of COVID on HIV, TB, and malaria is continuing, and in some ways is getting worse in 2021.
Which communities and which countries are you most concerned about?
The communities who are most at risk of HIV, TB, and malaria end up being the most at risk of COVID as well. We're talking about the poorest, the marginalized, refugees, displaced people, stigmatized populations who find it difficult to get access to health services, and often women and young girls who, again, face gender-related barriers to health access. In terms of countries, what we saw is that in the highest burden countries for each of the diseases tended to be the ones that had the biggest impact. So India, for example, has the highest TB burden in the world and saw a very dramatic fall in people being tested and brought onto treatment in the early months of the crisis, then rebuilt somewhat as they got their programs going again, but then got knocked off course again by the resurgence, the terrible resurgence of COVID-19 we saw from April onwards of this year.
What policies are needed at this time to get the global fight against these diseases back on track?
We definitely need to accelerate equitable deployment of vaccines for COVID-19 as much as we can. But we also need to accelerate equitable deployment of the other tools countries need to fight COVID-19. Tests, treatments, oxygen, PPE, and so on. We have to give countries the armory to respond effectively to this new pandemic. And that, in a way, is a precondition of getting us back on track on HIV, TB, and malaria. And we will need more resources for HIV, TB, and malaria because we have gone backwards. And we know what to do, but we need two things. We need to be on top of COVID-19, and we need the resources to be able to regain the ground we've lost.
Stay with us here on CGTN. We'll tell you why it's all about electric at the Munich Auto Show.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
The fight against poverty has suffered a setback.
We
are at a turning point in history.
It's a world under great distress and disruption.
But solving the crisis is still possible.
Change is indeed coming.
Join me, Stephen Cole, for a special 1 hour-long show here on CGTN where we speak to some of the world's top leaders and experts standing on the front line of the fight against poverty.
It's a real mistake to think that the future is decided for us. We need dialogue.
We'll spark debate.
The biggest challenge is addressing inequality.
We'll explore the solutions.
This can be done, but it requires everybody working together.
And we'll showcase the success stories to reveal how the cycle of poverty can be broken. Innovation, action, change. Only on CGTN.
Welcome back. The International Motor Show is in full swing in Munich.
It's the first major auto show in Germany since the pandemic and is seen as a fresh start for auto trade fairs. The focus of this year's event is electrification and alternative transport.
Volkswagen has unveiled a fully electric small car at the Munich Auto Show. The largest car maker in Europe also plans to set up a venture capital fund to invest in decarbonisation projects and startups. CGTN spoke with its CEO, Herbert Diess, on the company's electrification strategy.
Yeah, I would say it's still questionable whether we can be the most or the biggest manufacturer of EVs next year, but we have a plan to become until 25. All the investments are done. We are really coming with a range of products from the top of the line, Porsche, Audi e-trons, Volkswagen IDs. Volkswagen has a wide range of EVs already covering all major segments. ID Bus coming next year. So basically all core segments are covered with dedicated EVs, and this is happening worldwide. So ID4 is being sold in Europe, in China, in the United States. It's hit the market and it's quite successful. So we have prepared a lot. We took early decisions already 7-8 years ago, the first decision, and then some 4 years ago we really agreed on the model range, on the battery plants. This is why we are geared up well for becoming very relevant in the EV market, and we see the electrification also as an opportunity to become more relevant in some of the world's regions, like in the US. And it's the only way to remain relevant in China, where we are already strong. So there's a lot of emphasis on the electrification, and it's going well. We have good order intake. In some markets, we're already selling 60-80% of EVs, like Norway, Sweden. And even in Germany, we are selling over 20% EVs currently, which is quite a lot.
And finally, Madrid Zoo has welcomed 2 exciting new arrivals, twin giant panda cubs. One seen here just moments after being born. It's a boost to conservation efforts for the vulnerable species. Giant panda numbers have been rebounding in recent years thanks to an international captive breeding program.
The 2 newborns are healthy and wriggled their way through their first neonatal examinations on Tuesday. The cubs are the 5th and 6th born to Madrid's female panda, Hua Zuiba, and her partner, Bingxing.
The headlines again. Blackrock raises $1 billion for its Maiden Chinese market fund.
An explosive start for Bitcoin in El Salvador. The cryptocurrency becomes legal tender, sparking protests in the capital.
And the international community reacts cautiously to the Taliban's interim government.
Well, that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching. More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, also on YouTube and Dailymotion, and the CGTN app and cgtn.com, and in the UK 24 hours a day on Freeview. Up next, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow at the same time, same place, from us and the rest of the team in London. Bye.